The boundaries between predator and prey, between danger and protection, between the instincts that drive animals to kill and those that compel them to nurture, are among nature's most fundamental divisions, carved deep into the evolutionary history of every species through millions of years of natural selection that rewarded behaviors promoting survival and eliminated those that didn't. For predators like lions, whose entire existence depends on their ability to hunt and kill other animals for food, the drive to attack vulnerable prey is so deeply ingrained that it operates almost automatically, triggering at the sight, sound, or scent of potential food animals in ways that require no conscious decision or deliberation. This predatory response is particularly strong when the potential prey is young, small, and helpless, precisely the characteristics that make infant animals of any species appear as easy meals requiring minimal effort or risk to capture. The idea that a lioness, a creature designed by evolution to be an efficient killer of exactly such vulnerable targets, would not only refrain from attacking a helpless infant, but would actively protect it from other threats, seems to violate every principle of predatory behavior and to demand explanations that challenge our understanding of animal instinct, cognition, and the circumstances under which normal behavioral patterns can be overridden or redirected in extraordinary ways. This is the story of an incident that occurred in rural Ethiopia in June 2005, an event so remarkable and so seemingly impossible that when it was first reported, many people dismissed it as fabrication, as misinterpretation of what had actually occurred, or as a story that had grown in the telling until it bore little resemblance to whatever mundane reality might have inspired it. But the incident was witnessed by multiple people, was investigated by authorities, was documented by journalists and wildlife experts, and was reported by credible news organizations including the Associated Press and BBC, making its basic facts, however extraordinary they might seem, a matter of verified record rather than unsubstantiated rumor. What can be debated, what has been discussed extensively in the nearly 2 decades since the incident occurred, is how to interpret what happened, what it reveals about lion behavior and cognition, and whether the incident represents a bizarre anomaly that tells us nothing generalizable about these animals, or whether it reveals capacities and behavioral flexibility that exist in lions, but that are only rarely expressed under the specific circumstances that make such expression possible or adaptive. The incident occurred in a rural area of southwestern Ethiopia, in a region where small farming and pastoral communities existed in close proximity to wilderness areas that still harbored wildlife, including spotted hyenas, leopards, and occasionally lions, though lion populations in Ethiopia had declined dramatically over the previous century due to habitat loss, conflict with livestock owners, and direct persecution that had eliminated these predators from much of their former range across the country. The communities in this region practiced mixed subsistence agriculture, growing crops including maize, teff, and various vegetables during the rainy season, and keeping small numbers of livestock, including goats, sheep, and cattle, that provided milk, meat, and economic security for families living at or near poverty level by any global standard of measurement. The relationship between these communities and the remaining wildlife was complex and often antagonistic, with predators posing real threats to livestock that represented significant portions of household wealth and occasionally to human safety, particularly for children and for people traveling alone through isolated areas, creating incentives for killing predators whenever opportunities arose, and creating a cycle of conflict that made conservation of large carnivores in such areas extremely challenging despite their ecological importance and their cultural significance. The specific incident began with what was tragically not an uncommon occurrence in impoverished rural areas lacking adequate social services, law enforcement capacity, and support systems for vulnerable families, particularly for women and girls who faced discrimination and violence that authorities were often unable or unwilling to address effectively. A 12-year-old girl from one of the villages in the region, whose name was withheld by authorities to protect her privacy and that of her family from unwanted attention and from potential retaliation, was abducted by several men who apparently intended to force her into marriage through the practice known as marriage by abduction or bride kidnapping. a tradition that, while officially illegal under Ethiopian law, remained depressingly common in some rural areas where traditional customs conflicted with national laws and where enforcement of legal protections for women and girls was minimal or non-existent due to lack of resources, geographical isolation, and sometimes cultural acceptance or tolerance of practices that violated human rights. The girl was taken from her village under circumstances that remain somewhat unclear in the public record, with some accounts suggesting she was seized while walking alone outside the village, and others indicating she may have been taken from her home when other family members were absent or unable to protect her. She was transported some distance into the bush to an isolated location where her captors apparently felt safe from immediate discovery or intervention by authorities or by the girl's family members, and where they held her for approximately 7 days, during which time she was certainly traumatized both by the abduction itself and by the uncertainty and fear about what would happen to her, though the full details of her treatment during this captivity were never made fully public out of respect for her dignity and privacy, and out of recognition that forcing her to recount traumatic experiences in detail could cause additional psychological harm. At some point during this week-long captivity, under circumstances that remain somewhat unclear because the girl herself was too traumatized to provide complete, coherent accounts immediately after her rescue, and because her abductors certainly had no incentive to clarify exactly what happened or to cooperate with investigations into their criminal activities, the girl was apparently left alone temporarily, either because the men felt confident she couldn't escape from the remote location where they were holding her, or because some disruption or distraction drew them away from the immediate area where she was being held. Finding herself alone, or at least not under direct supervision, the girl either escaped from physical restraints or simply fled from the location, running into the surrounding bush in a desperate attempt to get away from her captors and to find help, or to return to her village, though she had no clear idea of which direction to travel or how to navigate through unfamiliar wilderness to reach safety. She was lost, terrified, alone in an environment that was dangerous even for adults with experience and knowledge of the area. And she was crying, making the kinds of distressed vocalizations that a frightened child would naturally produce, sounds that combined fear, desperation, and perhaps calls for help, even though she probably had no realistic expectation that anyone would hear her in such an isolated location. These cries, however, did attract attention, though not from the humans she hoped might rescue her. In the African bush, sounds travel considerable distances, particularly during the quiet hours when other noise is minimal, and various animals use acoustic cues to locate prey, to avoid predators, or to find members of their own species. The crying of a distressed child produces sounds that are loud enough and distinctive enough to be detected by animals with acute hearing across distances of several hundred meters or more, and which can trigger various responses depending on the species detecting them and on how those sounds are interpreted through that species' perceptual and behavioral systems. It was at this point, when the girl was at her most vulnerable, alone in the wilderness without protection or resources or any clear path to safety, that she encountered a lioness whose presence in this area was itself somewhat remarkable given the sparse lion population in the region, and given that lions were typically wary of areas with heavy human presence. The lioness, origin unknown and reasons for being in this specific area at this specific time unclear and ultimately unknowable, since she was never identified or studied before or after this incident, apparently heard the girl's cries and approached to investigate, responding in the way that predators typically do to sounds that might indicate prey animals, particularly prey in distress that might be vulnerable and easy to capture. The girl, seeing the approaching lioness emerging from the vegetation, was certainly terrified beyond anything she had experienced even during her week-long captivity, understanding that she now faced a threat that was immediately lethal, that could kill her in seconds with a bite to her neck or skull, and from which she had no realistic hope of escape, given the speed and power of a lion compared to a 12-year-old human child already weakened by stress, fear, and probably inadequate food and water during her captivity. But what happened next, instead of the attack that seemed inevitable, and that any rational assessment of the situation based on known lion behavior would have predicted with near certainty, was something that defied all expectation and all normal patterns of predator-prey interaction documented in decades of scientific research on lion hunting behavior and prey selection. The lioness, upon reaching the girl and having clear opportunity to attack a vulnerable target that could not possibly defend itself or escape, did not spring forward to kill. Instead, according to the girl's subsequent accounts provided to authorities and to wildlife experts who interviewed her after her rescue, and according to the observations of the people who eventually found them both together and who witnessed at least the final portion of their interaction, the lioness positioned herself near the girl in a manner that seemed protective rather than predatory, lying down close to where the girl sat or crouched in her terror, watching the surrounding area with alert vigilance that suggested she was monitoring for threats rather than preparing to feed, and showing body language, including ear position, tail movement, and overall posture that communicated guardianship rather than hunting or feeding behavior that experienced observers could clearly distinguish from predatory postures. This remarkable and unprecedented situation continued for what witnesses estimated, based on various factors, including the position of the sun and the timeline of the search efforts, was approximately half a day, meaning several hours during the afternoon and possibly into the early evening, hours during which the lioness remained with the girl, maintaining her protective position near the frightened child, occasionally shifting location when the girl moved due to discomfort or fear, but always staying close, always maintaining awareness of the surroundings through visual scanning and through her acute hearing that could detect sounds far beyond human perceptual range, and most remarkably, showing no aggression whatsoever toward the girl herself, no attempts to attack or to treat her as prey, despite the fact that a 12-year-old child would normally be well within the size and vulnerability range that lions would readily attack and consume, particularly a child who was alone, unprotected, and clearly incapable of defending herself or posing any threat to the lioness. The girl, after her initial terror, began to subside somewhat as minutes passed without the expected attack, as she began to realize through direct experience that contradicted everything she knew or believed about lions that this particular lioness was not going to kill her. At least not immediately, apparently became somewhat calmer, though she remained understandably frightened and deeply confused by this surreal situation where the creature that should have been her executioner had instead become something like her guardian or companion. She reportedly remained very still, afraid that any sudden movement might trigger an attack, occasionally making eye contact with the lioness and seeing in those golden eyes something that she later struggled to describe, but that seemed to her not to contain the cold, predatory assessment she expected, but rather something she interpreted perhaps through wishful thinking or perhaps through genuine perception as concern or protectiveness, though attributing such human-like emotions to a wild predator requires making assumptions about subjective experience and consciousness that go far beyond what observable behavior alone can definitively support. The situation came to the attention of the outside world, and particularly to the search parties that had been organized to look for the missing girl, when villagers who had been searching for her across a wide area following various leads and checking locations where they thought she might have been taken by her abductors or where she might have fled if she had managed to escape, heard what they initially thought was the growling or roaring of a lion, sounds that made them immediately cautious and alert to danger given the potential for fatal encounters with such predators. As they approached the source of the sounds more carefully, trying to locate the lion and to avoid a dangerous encounter that could result in injury or death, moving slowly through the vegetation and communicating with each other through hand signals to coordinate their approach while minimizing noise, they discovered the extraordinary scene of the lioness and the girl together. The lioness positioned protectively near the child in a manner that the searchers found initially impossible to interpret or understand, given everything they knew and believed about how lions behave toward humans, and particularly toward vulnerable humans who would normally be seen as potential prey. The men who found them, 3 farmers from the girls' village who had volunteered for the search, despite the dangers involved in traversing areas where predators might be encountered, faced an extremely delicate and dangerous situation that required quick thinking and careful action. They needed to rescue the girl, to separate her from the lioness, and to bring her to safety and to medical attention and to her desperate family. But any attempt to approach the girl while the lioness was present created obvious risks both to themselves and potentially to the girl if the lioness reacted defensively to their approach, if she perceived them as threats to something she was guarding, or if the presence of multiple humans triggered different behavioral responses than the lioness had shown toward the girl alone, possibly including viewing the girl as prey when other humans appeared and activated predatory circuits that had somehow remained dormant during the hours when only the girl was present. The men, showing considerable courage and also strategic thinking informed by their lifelong experience living in proximity to dangerous wildlife, made noise to attract the lioness's attention away from the girl, shouting and banging sticks together to create sounds that would signal human presence, while also being prepared to defend themselves with the tools and weapons they carried, including heavy sticks, and at least one firearm that one of the men had brought for protection during the search. They positioned themselves to create a distraction while also maintaining escape routes if the lioness charged, and they coordinated their movements so that if one needed to retreat, the others could provide support or intervention, demonstrating the kind of cooperative risk management that rural communities develop through generations of experience coexisting with dangerous wildlife. What happened next was perhaps the most remarkable part of this already extraordinary incident, and the aspect that most strongly suggested the lioness possessed some form of awareness or understanding that went beyond simple instinctive responses to immediate stimuli. The lioness, upon seeing and hearing the approaching humans, did not attack either them or the girl, as might have been expected if she was guarding food or defending territory or young. Instead, according to multiple witness accounts that were consistent across the 3 men who observed this behavior, and that were later corroborated by interviews conducted by authorities and by wildlife experts investigating the incident. The lioness stood up from her position near the girl, looked at the girl one final time in a manner that the witnesses described as almost deliberate or meaningful, though they acknowledged the difficulty of interpreting animal facial expressions and the risk of anthropomorphizing, and then simply walked away, departing into the bush at a steady pace that was neither hurried flight nor aggressive charge, moving with what appeared to be calm purpose back into the wilderness from which she had emerged and disappearing as mysteriously and incomprehensibly as she had apparently arrived hours earlier, leaving the girl completely unharmed and allowing the rescuers to reach her without any confrontation or violence or need to use their weapons in defense. The girl was immediately taken into the care of her rescuers, who wrapped her in cloth for warmth and comfort, gave her water to drink since she was severely dehydrated from her ordeal, and began the journey back to the village, carrying her when she proved too weak to walk the entire distance, bringing her first to her family, who were overcome with relief and joy at her survival after a week during which they had feared the worst, and then to medical care at a clinic in a nearby town where she could be examined and treated for her physical injuries and where she could begin receiving the psychological support she would need to process the multiple traumas she had experienced, including the initial abduction, the week of captivity, the terror of being lost in the bush, the encounter with the lioness, and all the uncertainty and fear that each of these experiences had generated. The authorities were notified about both the abduction and the remarkable incident with the lioness, and investigations were launched on multiple fronts. Police worked to identify, locate, and arrest the men responsible for the kidnapping, eventually succeeding in apprehending several individuals who were prosecuted under Ethiopian law, though the penalties they received were criticized by human rights advocates and women's rights organizations as being insufficient, given the severity of the crime and given the need to send stronger deterrent messages about such violations. Simultaneously, wildlife authorities and conservation organizations began investigating the incident with the lioness, trying to understand what had occurred and what it might reveal about lion behavior, trying to determine whether the lioness could be identified and studied further, and trying to assess what implications the incident might have for human-wildlife coexistence in the region. Dr. Stuart Williams, a wildlife expert who was working in Ethiopia at the time with the Born Free Foundation on lion conservation projects, and who had extensive experience studying large predator behavior across multiple African countries, was among the first scientists to investigate the incident thoroughly. Dr. Williams interviewed the girl when she had recovered sufficiently and felt comfortable discussing her experience, spoke at length with the 3 men who had rescued her and who had witnessed the lioness's departure, visited the site where the incident had occurred to examine the physical setting and to look for any tracks or other evidence that might provide additional information, and consulted with other experts in lion behavior, including researchers who had documented other rare cases of predators showing unusual tolerance toward potential prey, to develop theories about what might have caused a lioness to protect rather than attack a vulnerable human child. Several possible explanations emerged from this analysis, each with different implications for understanding lion cognition and behavior, and each with varying degrees of support from the available evidence and from comparative cases in the scientific literature. The first and perhaps most compelling theory, the one that Dr. Williams found most consistent with the known facts and with established principles of animal behavior, centered on acoustic similarity between the sounds a distressed child makes when crying and the vocalizations that lion cubs produce when separated from their mothers or when in distress or danger. Research on mammalian vocalizations conducted over decades by scientists studying communication across many species has demonstrated that distress calls from young mammals share certain acoustic features, including specific frequency ranges, typically between 1,000 and 5,000 Hz, patterns of amplitude modulation that create the characteristic crying or whimpering quality, and other characteristics that appear to be somewhat universal across mammalian species, possibly because these shared features tap into deep evolutionary patterns in how mammalian brains process and respond to sounds indicating distress in young vulnerable individuals who need assistance or protection. If the lioness heard the girls crying, and if those sounds were similar enough to lion cub distress vocalizations in their acoustic properties that they triggered maternal or protective responses rather than predatory responses, possibly because the sounds activated neural pathways and hormonal systems associated with maternal care rather than with hunting, this could explain why the lioness approached with protective rather than predatory intent from the very beginning of the encounter. This theory gained support from observations made by the men who rescued the girl, who reported that when they first heard what they thought was lion sounds, the vocalizations they heard included not just the lioness's growling, but also what they described in retrospect as sounds that might have been the lioness responding to the girl's crying with vocalizations similar to those lionesses use to communicate with cubs. Though this observation was made under stressful circumstances by people without formal training in animal behavior and therefore had to be interpreted cautiously. The theory was further supported by the observation that the lioness appeared based on physical characteristics described by the witnesses to have been recently lactating, with mammary glands that showed signs of milk production, suggesting she might have recently lost cubs of her own through predation by other lions or hyenas, through disease or starvation during drought periods, or through other causes that made cub mortality unfortunately common in wild lion populations. If the lioness had recently lost her cubs and was experiencing the powerful hormonal drives associated with lactation and maternal care, but had no cubs to direct these behaviors toward, the distressed human child crying in sounds that resembled cub vocalizations might have served as a surrogate that allowed her to express these maternal behaviors that were seeking an outlet, creating a situation where misdirected maternal instinct overrode predatory responses that would normally have been triggered by encountering a vulnerable young human. A second theory that Dr. Williams considered focused on the specific age and size of the girl and on how these factors might have influenced the lioness's categorization of what she was encountering. First, it showed that behavior was not rigidly determined by instinct alone, but was influenced by multiple factors, including physiological states such as hormonal conditions associated with lactation and maternal care, by recent individual experiences, including the loss of cubs that created unfulfilled drives to provide maternal care, by contextual cues, including specific vocalizations and visual stimuli that could activate different behavioral pathways depending on how they were perceived and categorized, and by cognitive processes that might include some form of assessment or decision-making about how to respond to novel or ambiguous situations that didn't fit clearly into established categories. Second, the incident demonstrated that even behaviors as fundamental as predation, which might seem to be the most fixed and instinctive responses in a predator's behavioral repertoire, could be overridden or redirected under specific circumstances, that the boundary between prey and protected young was not absolute and impermeable, but could be crossed when the right combination of factors was present. This finding had theoretical implications for understanding the evolution of maternal behavior and for understanding how neural systems managing maternal care and predatory responses were organized in mammalian brains, suggesting that these systems, while usually producing opposite behavioral outputs, might share some common perceptual inputs, or might be organized in ways that made cross-activation possible under unusual circumstances. Third, the incident highlighted the critical importance of individual variation in animal behavior. The reality that while species-typical descriptions and generalizations about how lions behave provided useful frameworks and generally accurate predictions for most individuals in most circumstances, individual animals could deviate dramatically from these generalizations in ways that were not simply random noise or measurement error, but that might reflect genuine personality differences, cognitive capabilities, or experiential effects that shaped how specific individuals responded to specific situations in ways that could not be predicted solely from knowledge of species averages. The story of the lioness who guarded an abandoned girl attracted enormous media attention when it was first reported in June 2005, with coverage appearing in major newspapers and television programs around the world, documentary producers creating programs about the incident that reached audiences of millions, and the story being shared widely through early social media platforms and through email forwards in various forms that ranged from accurate reporting based on verified sources to highly embellished or distorted versions that added supernatural or miraculous elements that weren't supported by the actual documented facts, but that made the story more dramatic, or that fit it into existing cultural narratives about divine protection or about special relationships between humans and animals. For the girl herself, whose identity was carefully protected by Ethiopian authorities and by responsible journalists, and who was shielded as much as possible from media attention that could have caused additional trauma or that could have exposed her to unwanted public scrutiny. The incident represented one part of a larger ordeal that began with violent abduction and included multiple traumatic experiences, but that ended with her survival and eventual return to her life, though certainly marked and changed by what she had experienced. As she recovered and began the process of healing that would continue for years, she expressed through family members and through the few interviews she gave to trusted authorities that she felt gratitude toward the lioness who had stayed with her during those terrifying hours in the bush, though she acknowledged not fully understanding why the animal had behaved as it did or what had prevented the attack she had expected when the lioness first appeared. The question posed at the beginning of this story was what happened when a lioness was found guarding an abandoned baby. And the answer, documented through witness testimony and professional investigation, is that the lioness protected that child from other threats, remained with her during vulnerable hours when predators, exposure, or simple despair might have killed her, and then departed peacefully when human rescuers arrived. The story challenges our assumptions about predators, about instinct, about the capacity of animals to surprise us, and about the mysterious intersections of biology, circumstance, and individual variation that occasionally produce outcomes no one could predict or fully explain.